December 1989, 43-year-old bakery owner Carol Winters disappeared from her small town in rural Vermont on Christmas Eve, leaving behind fresh gingerbread cooling on the counter and wrapped presents under the tree. Her family spent 3 decades searching for answers while celebrating every holiday in her shadow. In February 2023, genetic genealogy traced DNA from evidence stored in a freezer for 34 years to a man who had led the original search party, organized fundraisers, and spent years comforting Carol's grieving family. The breakthrough came when a distant cousin uploaded their DNA to a public ancestry database, creating a family tree that investigators followed backward through 4 generations. The person who found Carol's body had been the one who put it there, and for 34 years, he sat at their Christmas table. If you find yourself drawn to stories of justice delayed but never denied, please subscribe to this channel. Every case we cover represents a family that refused to stop searching, investigators who never close the file, and the hope that truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deep it's buried. The morning of December 23, 1989, Detective Sarah Hartley stood in her kitchen watching snow accumulate on the windowsill. Fat flakes drifted down in the pre-dawn darkness, muffling the world in that peculiar silence that only comes with heavy snowfall. She had just poured her second cup of coffee when the phone rang. The sharp trill cut through the quiet, and her husband Tom glanced up from the newspaper, already knowing what that ring at 7:30 on a Saturday meant. 23 years of marriage to a detective taught you to read the omens. "Hartley," she answered, tucking the phone against her shoulder while setting down her coffee mug on the kitchen counter. The ceramic made a soft clink against the formica. "Detective, we need you at Winters Bakery on Main Street." The dispatcher's voice, usually calm and measured, carried an edge of urgency that made Sarah's chest tighten. "Owner didn't open this morning. Regulars are worried. Doors unlocked, lights on, but nobody's there." Sarah grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, her mind already racing through possibilities. In Millbrook, Vermont, a town of 8,000 people where everyone knew everyone's business, Carol Winters not opening her bakery on the Saturday before Christmas was like the sun not rising. The woman had baked fresh bread and pastries every morning for 17 years, arriving at 4:30 to start her ovens, never missing a day except when her mother died of pneumonia back in 1985. The regulars had their routines timed to Carol's schedule. Old Pete Henderson got his coffee and Danish at 6 sharp before his shift at the hardware store. The nurses from the clinic grabbed muffins on their way to the 7 o'clock shift change. The high school kids bought cinnamon rolls before Saturday detention. Carol knew every order by heart, had their bags ready before they walked through the door. The drive through town took 5 minutes through streets transformed by fresh snow. Christmas lights glowed in every window, red and green and gold against the white. Wreaths hung on doors, their pine scent mixing with wood smoke from chimneys. The town square's enormous spruce stood decorated with ornaments made by local school children, hundreds of handcrafted stars and angels catching the streetlight. Sarah had lived in Millbrook her entire 41 years, had watched Carol transform a failing diner into the bakery that became the heart of Main Street, the place where deals were made and gossip exchanged, and life was measured in cups of coffee and warm bread. 2 patrol cars already blocked the bakery entrance, their lights swirling blue and red across the snow. Officer Mike Brennan met her at the door, his face grim despite the Santa hat perched on his head. His wife made him wear it every December, a tradition that usually made Sarah smile. Today it just looked obscene, that cheerful red felt against the backdrop of something wrong. Door was open when old Pete tried to get his morning coffee at 6, Mike said, following her inside where the warmth hit like a wall. Lights were on, Registers closed with yesterday's receipts still inside, back doors locked from the outside, coffee makers cold. But there's fresh gingerbread on the cooling racks, detective, like she was just here. The scent of cinnamon and molasses hung in the air like a ghost, sweet and rich, and somehow ominous in the empty space. Sarah moved through the front area, her practiced eye cataloging every detail. The display case still held yesterday's unsold items, arranged with Carol's characteristic care. Croissants in one row, Danish in another, each pastry positioned to catch the light. The chalkboard behind the counter listed the daily specials in Carol's neat handwriting. Saturday, December 23rd. Fresh gingerbread, peppermint brownies, eggnog bread. Everything in its place except Carol herself. She pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen where industrial mixers stood silent like sleeping giants. Measuring cups lined up on the counter in graduated sizes. A handwritten recipe card for sugar cookies propped against the wall, the paper yellowed and flour-stained from years of use. Spice jars arranged alphabetically. Cooling racks holding 36 perfectly formed gingerbread men. On the main counter, the gingerbread cookies lay in perfect rows, their icing eyes staring at nothing. Each cookie was identical, the product of decades of practice. White icing outlined the gingerbread men's bodies, 3 buttons down the chest, simple smiles, tiny curved lines for eyes, Carol's signature style, unmistakable to anyone who'd ever bought her Christmas cookies. Carol always made these for the Christmas Eve party at the church, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper in the too-still kitchen. She picked up one of the cookies, examined the careful detail work, the precision in every line. She was here last night, probably working late to finish orders. These would take hours to decorate. Mike pointed to a cup of tea on the side counter, steam long since dissipated. Still has the tea bag in it, barely touched. And look at this. He led her to the sink where a mixing bowl sat half-washed, soapy water turned cold and scummy. Carol was meticulous about cleaning as she worked, never leaving dishes for later. This bowl represented an interruption, something that pulled her away mid-task. Sarah photographed everything, her mind already building timelines, sequences, possibilities. She moved through the kitchen with methodical precision, opening drawers, checking closets, looking for anything out of place. Carol's apron hung on its usual hook, the white fabric stained with years of baking history. Her work clogs sat by the back door, paired neatly as always. But Carol's winter coat was gone from the hook where employees kept their outerwear. Her purse still hung in the tiny office, wallet intact with $43 and 3 credit cards tucked in their slots. The phone on the wall showed no signs of struggle, the cord hanging straight and untwisted. It's like she stepped outside for a minute and never came back, Mike said, voicing what Sarah was thinking. But Sarah saw what he missed. She moved to the back door, studying the deadbolt. This lock can only be engaged from the outside with a key. Carol's keys are in her car. Someone else locked this door after she left, or after someone took her. She pushed open the door and stepped into the alley behind the bakery. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, a pristine white blanket covering any tracks that might have existed. The alley ran behind the entire block of Main Street businesses, a service corridor for deliveries and trash pickup. The dumpster sat 20 feet from Carol's back door, its green metal sides half buried in snow. Beyond it, the alley opened onto Elm Street, which ran parallel to Main and connected to the state highway 2 blocks north. Sarah stood in the cold, her breath forming clouds in the December air, trying to see the scene through a predator's eyes. This alley was dark at night, poorly lit by a single street lamp at each end. Someone standing here could watch the bakery's kitchen through the high windows, could time Carol's movements, could wait for the perfect moment. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked the length of the alley, looking for anything unusual. She found tire tracks in the alley entrance where someone had turned around, but they were already disappearing under fresh snowfall. Could be anyone. Could be nothing. Could be everything. "Start calling everyone," Sarah said, turning back to Mike, who'd followed her outside. "Anyone who might have seen Carol after closing yesterday. Get me a list of all her Christmas orders, every name, every phone number, and find out who was supposed to help her at the church party tonight. Someone expected to see her. Someone's waiting for those gingerbread men." By noon, Sarah knew the basic timeline, though it raised more questions than it answered. Carol had closed the bakery at 6 on December 22nd, normal for a Friday. The last customer, a teenager buying cookies for his grandmother, left at 5:57. Carol locked the front door at 6, turned the sign to closed, and began cleaning up. Beth Morrison, her assistant manager, told Sarah she'd offered to stay and help finish the Christmas orders. Carol was making gingerbread men, sugar cookies shaped like Christmas trees, and 6 special cakes for families. Beth explained, sitting in the now cold bakery, her hands shaking around a cup of coffee that Mike had brought from the diner down the street. She had the whole weekend planned out, hour by hour, said she'd start with the gingerbread because they needed time to cool before decorating. "What did she say when you offered to stay?" Sarah asked, taking notes in her worn leather notebook. "She said no." Beth's eyes filled with tears. "She said I should go home to my kids, that she liked working alone at night. She said it was peaceful, that she could put on Christmas music and bake for hours without distractions. She said she'd done it 100 times before." Beth's voice broke on the last words. Sarah waited, giving her time to compose herself. The bakery felt like a tomb now, cold and empty, and haunted by the absence of its creator. "Did Carol seem worried about anything?" Sarah asked. "Nervous? Did she mention anyone bothering her?" Beth shook her head, then paused. "There was something. The phone calls. Started maybe 2 weeks ago. Carol would answer the phone at the bakery, and nobody would be there. Just breathing, then click. It happened 5 or 6 times, always late afternoon, right before closing. Carol joked that it was probably teenagers playing pranks." Sarah's pen froze on the page. "She reported these calls?" "No. She didn't think they were serious. Carol wasn't the type to worry." Beth looked up, her eyes red. "Should she have worried, Detective? Could she have prevented this?" "This isn't on her," Sarah said firmly. "Whatever happened, it's not Carol's fault." But privately, Sarah felt the familiar weight of a case that was already going cold. No witnesses, no obvious signs of struggle. A woman who vanished from a locked bakery, leaving nothing behind but gingerbread men and questions. Carol's husband, David, arrived at the bakery at 1 o'clock, his face drained of color. He was a quiet man, a high school history teacher who coached junior varsity basketball. Sarah had known him since they were teenagers together. "She didn't come home last night," David said, his voice hollow. "I thought she'd fallen asleep at the bakery. She's done that before during busy seasons. I came by around 11 last night to bring her dinner, but the lights were off. I figured she'd gone home and I'd missed her." "The lights were off at 11? Sarah asked sharply. "Completely dark. I tried the front door, but it was locked." Sarah made a note. Someone had turned off the lights after Carol disappeared. Someone who had access, who knew where the switches were. David listed everyone Carol might have had contact with. Her sister in Burlington, calling every day. Her suppliers. the ones who delivered flour and sugar every Monday. The church committee, planning the Christmas Eve party. Her regular customers, the ones who picked up standing orders. What about friends? Sarah asked. Who would Carol call if she needed help with something? David's answer came without hesitation. Robert Thorne. He lives 3 doors down from us. Been our neighbor for 12 years. He helps her with equipment repairs, heavy lifting. He's been like family. Sarah wrote down the name, but something in David's tone made her pause. Like family? Carol couldn't have kids, David said quietly. Robert lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago. They have coffee together sometimes. She bakes his birthday cake. He fixes things around our house. He looked up at Sarah. Are you going to tell me she's just missing? Or are we past that? Sarah met his eyes. In small towns, everyone knew everyone's business. David was a smart man. He could read the scene as well as she could. We're looking at all possibilities, she said. But yes, David, we're treating this as something more than a missing person. The search began at 3 o'clock on December 23, 1989. Word had spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town tragedy could muster. By the time Sarah stood in the town hall basement to organize the effort, 60 volunteers had showed up wearing winter coats and carrying flashlights, thermoses of coffee, sandwiches wrapped in foil. People she'd known her entire life. Her 3rd-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, the man who ran the hardware store, young mothers pushing strollers with toddlers bundled against the cold, high school kids cutting through the usual Saturday activities because someone's mother or aunt or neighbor was missing. The police chief, a barrel-chested man named Frank Morrison, who'd been on the force for 37 years, divided everyone into teams. He spread a topographical map of Millbrook and the surrounding area across 3 folding tables pushed together, marking grid sections with a red marker that squeaked against the paper. We search systematically, Frank announced, his voice carrying authority earned through decades of service. Each team takes a grid. You stay within your boundaries. You look for anything unusual, clothing, disturbances in the snow, signs of struggle. You find something. You don't touch it. You mark the location and radio it in immediately. Sarah watched the volunteers sort themselves into groups, some natural, some assigned by Frank based on physical capability and local knowledge. The younger men and women took the harder terrain, the woods and steep hills. Older folks took the neighborhoods, the easy walking, the door-to-door inquiries. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone needed to feel like they were doing something. Robert Thorne arrived early, while Frank was still explaining the grid system. He stood at the edge of the crowd, weathered face serious under his wool cap, hands thrust deep in his jacket pockets. Sarah studied him for a moment. This man who'd been described as family. He was 48 years old, medium height and build, the kind of physical presence that didn't draw attention. A face you'd pass on the street without noticing. But his eyes, when he looked at the map, held an intensity that Sarah filed away for later consideration. I want to search the woods behind the industrial park, Robert said, approaching Sarah and Frank with the map. He pointed to an area north of town where old factories stood empty, relics of Millbrook's brief industrial heyday in the 1960s. There's an old logging road back there that connects to Route 7. If someone took Carol out of town, that's the way they'd go. Less traffic, no houses to see them. You know the area well? Sarah asked, watching his face. Hunted there for years. I know every trail, every clearing. I could search that section faster than anyone. He met her eyes steadily, no hesitation, no guilt showing. Carol's been missing for almost 20 hours now. Every minute counts. Sarah assigned him a team of 6 volunteers, strong young men who could keep up if Robert moved fast. She watched them head out in his pickup truck, a blue Ford with a contractor's rack on the back, tools stored in the bed under a locked cover. They searched for 6 hours as daylight faded and temperature dropped to single digits. Sarah coordinated from the town hall, tracking teams on the map, fielding radio reports. Dogs from the state police tracked scents that went nowhere, confused by the fresh snow and the number of people crossing and recrossing the search area. Volunteers checked abandoned buildings, old barns leaning against time, drainage ditches filled with frozen water, the banks of Mill Creek where ice formed in sheets along the edges. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a thread of fabric, not a single indication that Carol Winters had been anywhere except inside her bakery before vanishing into air. At 9 o'clock, with volunteers stumbling from exhaustion and cold, Sarah called off the search until morning. They gathered back at the town hall, faces red from wind, hands wrapped around coffee cups that the ladies' auxiliary had brewed in industrial-sized urns. Someone had brought pizza from Angelo's. Someone else started a sign-up sheet for the next day's search, filling 3 pages with names before Sarah could even reach the table. Robert Thorne stood by the map, marking areas they'd covered with red pen, his handwriting neat and precise. Military training showed in his posture, the way he organized information, the systematic approach to chaos. When Sarah approached, he looked up with tired eyes that somehow held no defeat. "We'll find her," he said with such conviction it almost sounded like prophecy. "Carol's strong. If she's out there somewhere, she's fighting to get home. She wouldn't give up. We can't give up either." The certainty in his voice almost convinced Sarah. Almost. But she'd been a detective too long to trust certainty in uncertain situations. Hope was dangerous in missing persons cases. Hope made you see what you wanted to see, instead of what was actually there. David Winters spent Christmas Eve at the police station, refusing to go home to the empty house where wrapped presents waited under the tree Carol had decorated the week before. He sat in the break room making calls, checking leads that went nowhere, drinking coffee that had been on the burner too long, wearing the same clothes he'd put on the morning before. His sister-in-law, Margaret, drove down from Burlington in the afternoon, her face carved from stone, her eyes holding the same hollow look as David's. "Carol called me Thursday night," Margaret told Sarah, sitting in the small interview room where they'd gone for privacy. She was excited about Christmas. She'd ordered this special ornament for David, something with a lighthouse on it, from their honeymoon in Cape Cod 22 years ago. She said she couldn't wait to see his face when he opened it. She was happy, Detective. Whatever happened, she was happy before it did. Did she mention anyone bothering her? Anyone making her uncomfortable? Any problems at the bakery or at home? Margaret shook her head, then paused, a memory surfacing. There was something she mentioned, actually. Those weird phone calls at the bakery. Someone kept calling and hanging up. She said it had happened 5 or 6 times over the past 2 weeks, always late afternoon, right before closing. She'd answer, hear breathing on the line, then click. She joked that it was probably teenagers playing pranks. You know how kids are during Christmas season. Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. Did she seem worried about the calls? No. Carol wasn't the type to worry. Or maybe she was just good at hiding it. Margaret's voice broke. She was always the strong one, you know. When our mother died, Carol planned the funeral, handled everything. When I got divorced, she drove up to Burlington twice a week just to make sure I was eating. She took care of everyone. Who was taking care of her? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and accusatory at once. Sarah spent the rest of Christmas Eve pulling phone records for the bakery, The calls Margaret mentioned showed up clearly in the logs. 7 calls over 2 weeks, each lasting less than 10 seconds. All originated from payphones around Millbrook, different locations each time. Someone had been systematic about it, never using the same phone twice. Someone who understood how tracing worked. She mapped the payphone locations. One outside the gas station on Route 7, one at the grocery store, one at the rest stop north of town, one outside the public library. The pattern showed someone who moved through Millbrook regularly, who had access to different areas at different times, who blended in so completely that nobody noticed them making these calls. The Christmas Eve party at the church happened without Carol's gingerbread men. Someone brought store-bought cookies instead, but they sat mostly untouched on the refreshment table. The absence of Carol's baking felt like a presence itself, a hole in the celebration that everyone felt, but nobody quite knew how to name. Father Marcus led the congregation in prayers for Carol's safe return, his voice shaking with emotion. He was 72 years old, had married David and Carol 15 years earlier in this same church, had watched Carol bake communion bread every Sunday morning for a decade. After the service, he found Sarah standing in the cold parking lot, smoking a cigarette she'd bummed off Mike Brennan, even though she'd quit 5 years ago. Something evil happened, Father Marcus said quietly, pulling his coat tight against the wind. I can feel it in this town, Detective. A darkness that wasn't here before. Carol was light, pure light, and something reached out and extinguished her. Sarah didn't believe in spiritual darkness, but she believed in human evil. Did Carol ever come to you with concerns? Did she mention anyone making her uncomfortable? No. Carol kept her own counsel about such things, but she'd been coming to confession more regularly these past few months, every 2 weeks instead of her usual monthly schedule. The old priest hesitated, bound by rules about confidentiality. I can't tell you what she said, but I can tell you she was troubled by something, some moral question she was wrestling with. About what? That's what I can't say. But Detective, Father Marcus met her eyes. Carol was a good woman. Whatever troubled her, it wasn't because she'd done wrong. I think it was because she'd discovered wrong and didn't know what to do about it. Sarah filed this away, another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit anywhere yet. The search resumed Christmas morning, under skies heavy with the threat of more snow. 75 people showed up, some from neighboring towns who'd heard about the missing baker on the morning news. Robert Thorne arrived with thermoses of coffee and 3 boxes of donuts from a bakery in Rutland, organizing teams before Sarah even got there. He'd brought better radios too, handing out walkie-talkies to team leaders. Army surplus, he explained when Sarah questioned the equipment. Had them in my garage from my service days. Better range than those department store ones we used yesterday. We need every advantage we can get. Where did you serve? Sarah asked, making it sound casual. Germany mostly. 82nd Airborne, 1962 to 1972. Then reserves until 80. I was a communications specialist, installing and maintaining radio systems. He met her eyes steadily. We need to find her, Detective, whatever it takes. The second day of searching brought reporters from Burlington and Montpelier, news vans parking on Main Street, cameras filming the search volunteers as they headed out into the cold. Sarah gave brief statements, appealing for information, showing Carol's photo to the cameras. The missing woman smiled in every picture, her dark curls framing a face that radiated warmth even through photographs. The media attention generated tips. The police department's phone lines lit up with calls. Someone thought they'd seen Carol's car on Route 7 heading south toward Massachusetts. Someone else swore they'd spotted a woman matching her description at a rest stop near Rutland at 1 in the morning. A truck driver called saying he'd picked up a hitchhiker who might have been Carol, though she'd said her name was Susan. Every lead dissolved into nothing. The car sighting was a different model. The woman at the rest stop was 20 years younger. The hitchhiker had blonde hair and a southern accent. But Sarah followed each lead anyway, because the alternative was admitting Carol might never be found. On December 27th, everything changed. A hunter named Gary Mitchell, out checking rabbit snares in the woods 3 miles north of town, found Carol's winter coat hanging from a low branch of a white pine. He radioed it in immediately, smart enough to know that clothes don't hang themselves in trees. Sarah stood in the woods 40 minutes later, staring at the coat while the forensics team from the state police photographed it from every angle. The placement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Someone had carefully draped the coat over the branch, smoothing it out, making sure it would be visible from the trail. The bakery keys still nested in the right pocket, cold metal against her gloved hand when she checked after the photos were taken. Could be she got too hot while walking, Mike Brennan suggested, his voice uncertain even as he said it. Took off her coat and left it? In December in Vermont? Sarah shook her head, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. And her keys are in the pocket, Mike. Carol wouldn't leave her keys in a coat in the woods. She needed those keys to get back into her bakery, her car, her house. This was placed here by someone who wanted us to find it. Why? Mike asked. To lead us away from something, Sarah said, studying the surrounding terrain. Or to make us look in the wrong direction. Or maybe to prove they're smarter than we are. There's a psychology to this placement, something intentional. They searched a half-mile radius from where the coat was found, bringing in cadaver dogs that had been used successfully in 2 previous cases across the state. The dogs alerted on several spots, but each time they dug, they found animal remains, deer that had died naturally or been killed by coyotes. The woods were full of death, but none of it was Carol. Robert Thorne arrived at the scene even though his team had been assigned a different sector for the day. He stood beside Sarah, hands in pockets, studying the coat with a contractor's analytical eye, the same expression he probably wore when examining a faulty foundation or problematic roof. Someone put that there, he said, voicing what Sarah was thinking. Question is why? To lead us away from something, Sarah repeated. Or to make us look in the wrong direction. Someone's playing games, Robert. Someone who thinks they're clever. Robert nodded slowly, his jaw tight. I knew Carol for 12 years, Detective. She wouldn't just leave her coat in the woods. Someone's playing games with us, with her family, with this whole town. He turned to Sarah, anger flickering in his eyes. Catch them, whatever it takes. The forensics report came back 3 days later. The coat was clean, undamaged, showing no tears or blood evidence, no signs of struggle. The only biological evidence was Carol's own hair and skin cells from normal wear. But Patricia Chen, the lead forensic investigator, called Sarah directly with an update. There's something on the inner lining, Patricia said over the phone. A stain I almost missed because it's on the inside seam, where the lining meets the shell. I think it's blood. Very small amount, just a few spots. But it's definitely blood. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. Can you test it? Already sent the sample to the lab. DNA results take 3 to 6 weeks. You know the backlog. But Detective, if this is Carol's blood and it's on the inside of her coat, that suggests she was injured before or while the coat came off. And if someone else's DNA is mixed in, that's our killer. Those weeks of waiting felt like years. Sarah continued investigating, but every trail had gone cold. The anonymous phone calls led nowhere. The payphones had been used by dozens of people daily. Security cameras from that era were rare, and none of the businesses near the payphones had them. She interviewed everyone who knew Carol. Her suppliers told stories of a woman who paid her bills on time, who remembered their children's names, who baked birthday cakes for their employees. Her customers remembered her smile, the way she'd slip an extra cookie into a bag for a child, how she'd let elderly folks on fixed incomes run a tab and never mentioned it when they couldn't pay. The church committee said Carol had been planning the Christmas Eve party for months, recruiting volunteers, organizing the menu, even buying special decorations out of her own pocket. She never missed a commitment, said Father Marcus for the third time in as many interviews. If Carol said she'd be there, she'd crawl there if she had to. That's who she was. Sarah interviewed Carol's assistant manager, Beth Morrison, multiple times, each conversation revealing new layers. Carol kept meticulous records of every transaction, every ingredient, every expense. She'd recently raised wages for all her employees, cutting into her own profit margin to do it. She'd helped Beth's son get a scholarship to trade school, writing a reference letter and helping him fill out financial aid forms. She was the best person I ever worked for, Beth said through tears during their fourth interview. Not just a boss, a friend, a mentor. She taught me how to make French bread from scratch. She let me bring my kids to work when school was closed for snow days. She paid for my son's dental work when we couldn't afford it. She was family, detective. She was more than family. Every interview added depth to the portrait of Carol Winters, but none brought Sarah closer to finding her or identifying who'd taken her. Winter deepened into February, then March. The snow melted in stages, revealing frozen ground and dead grass and the detritus of a New England winter, but no sign of Carol Winters. Volunteers stopped searching as weeks became months. The news moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other missing women. Life in Millbrook slowly returned to its rhythms, though Main Street felt different with the bakery dark. David returned to teaching, but colleagues said he was a shell of himself, mechanically running basketball drills while his mind was clearly elsewhere, calling plays from muscle memory while his eyes stayed hollow. He lost 20 pounds in 2 months. His sister-in-law, Margaret, drove down from Burlington every weekend, making sure he ate, making sure he wasn't drinking too much, sitting with him in silence because no words helped anyway. The forensics reports offered little help. No fingerprints in the bakery except those belonging to Carol, Beth, and regular customers. No signs of struggle, no blood evidence. The coat showed no tears or damage, no biological evidence except Carol's own hair and skin cells. The phone records from the bakery showed the anonymous calls Margaret had mentioned. 7 calls over 2 weeks, each lasting less than 10 seconds. All from payphones around Millbrook. Someone had been watching Carol, but the calls gave no indication of who. Sarah created a timeline on the whiteboard in her office, mapping every minute of Carol's last known day. Closed bakery at 6. Stayed to work on Christmas orders. Still there at 9 when Beth called to check on her. Lights on at 10 when a passing patrol car noted them in the log. Lights off at 11 when David came by. That hour between 10 and 11 was when Carol vanished. Robert Thorne became a fixture at the police station, stopping by daily with updates from volunteers who were still searching on their own time. He brought Sarah coffee, organized new search grids, made himself indispensable. "I can't just sit home," he told her one evening in early January. "Carol was like a sister to me. After my wife died, Carol and David were the ones who kept me going, made sure I ate, invited me to dinners. Carol taught me how to make Denise's meatloaf recipe so I wouldn't forget what it tasted like. The grief in his voice sounded genuine. Sarah had run a background check on him weeks ago. Honorable discharge from the Army. No criminal record. His neighbors called him helpful, quiet, always willing to lend a hand. His wife had died of ovarian cancer in 1984, and by all accounts, he'd been devoted to her. "Tell me about December 22nd, Sarah said. "The night Carol disappeared. Where were you?" Robert didn't flinch at the question. "Home. I'd worked a construction job in Rutland, got back around 7, made dinner, watched the news, went to bed around 10:30. Anyone who can verify that?" "No. I live alone." He met her eyes. "Am I a suspect, detective?" "Everyone's a suspect until they're not," Sarah said. "It's not personal." "I understand. You're doing your job." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I just want to find her, whatever it takes." Winter deepened into February, then March. The snow melted, revealing nothing. Volunteers stopped searching. The news moved on to other stories. David returned to coaching basketball, but colleagues said he was a shell of himself, mechanically running drills while his mind was elsewhere. Sarah never stopped working the case, even as other investigations demanded her time. She reviewed it every evening after her official shift ended, sitting at her desk with Carol's photo propped against her desk lamp, studying timelines and witness statements until the words blurred together. She traveled to Burlington to interview Margaret again, asking the same questions from different angles, hoping something new would emerge. She drove to Rutland to personally verify Robert Thorne's alibi for December 22nd, visiting the construction site where he claimed to have worked that day. The site foreman confirmed Robert had been there, working on framing for a new office building, clocking out around 6:30. 45 minutes to drive back to Millbrook. That put him home around 7:15, with no witnesses for the rest of the night. Sarah reviewed every frame of security footage from every business on Main Street that had cameras, which in 1989 meant exactly 3 stores. The grocery store's camera pointed at the registers. The bank's camera covered the ATM. The pharmacy's camera watched the prescription counter. None captured the alley behind the bakery or the street where Carol might have been taken. She interviewed Linda Cooper, the woman who'd called in February about seeing someone in the alley the night Carol disappeared. Sarah sat in Linda's living room, looking out the same window where the woman had stood wrapping Christmas presents. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Sarah said, notebook open. "It was around 10:30, maybe 10:40, Linda said, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "I was wrapping presents for my grandchildren. The alley back there is usually empty that time of night, so when I saw someone standing still, I noticed. They were just standing there in the dark, maybe 15 or 20 feet from Carol's back door, watching the building." "Could you tell if it was a man or woman?" "Too dark. Medium height, winter coat, hat pulled low. They stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just watching. Then they walked away toward Elm Street." Linda paused. "I didn't think much of it at the time. People cut through that alley all the time. But standing still like that, just watching, it's been bothering me ever since Carol went missing." "Did you see where they went after they left the alley?" "No. Once they reached Elm Street, they were out of my sight line." Sarah added this to her timeline. Someone watching at 10:30. Lights still on in the bakery according to the patrol log at 10. Lights off when David arrived at 11. That 30-minute window when Carol had vanished. She checked the patrol logs again, this time reading every entry for December 22nd. Officer Tommy Martinez had done the 10 o'clock patrol of Main Street, noting in his log that lights were on at Winter's Bakery. Nothing unusual. He'd driven past again at 11:45, noting lights were off, doors locked, everything secure. Sarah called Tommy into her office. He was 26 years old, ambitious, hoping to make detective someday. He sat across from her desk, nervously adjusting his uniform. "Tell me about your patrols that night," Sarah said. "Standard route. Down Main, around the square, up Elm, back to Main. I saw Carol's lights on at 10. Figured she was working late like she does before holidays. Everything looked normal. Did you see anyone else? Any cars? Any people on the street?" Tommy thought hard. A few cars. Mrs. Peterson heading home from her sister's house. The Randolph kid driving too fast as usual. And there was a truck parked on Elm Street, near where it crosses the alley. Sarah leaned forward. "A truck? What kind?" "Pickup. Blue, I think, or maybe dark green. Hard to tell under the streetlights. It was there at 10, gone when I came back around at 11:45. Did you see who was in it?" "No. I just noted it was there. Lots of trucks in Millbrook, detective. Didn't seem important." But it was important. Someone in a truck, parked where they could access the alley, there at 10 and gone by midnight. Sarah had Tommy work with a sketch artist, trying to recall the make and model. He thought it might have been a Ford or Chevy, probably late 80s model, but couldn't be more specific. She compiled a list of everyone in Millbrook who drove a blue or dark green pickup truck. The list had 47 names. Robert Thorne's blue Ford was on it, along with half the contractors, farmers, and working men in town. The forensics reports came back in April, 5 months after Carol's disappearance. The blood on the coat's inner lining was Carol's, matching her blood type and the preliminary DNA markers. But mixed with it were skin cells from an unknown male, degraded but identifiable enough to create a DNA profile. "Someone grabbed Carol while she was wearing this coat," Patricia Chen explained to Sarah over the phone. "The transfer pattern suggests physical contact, probably someone grabbing her arms or shoulders. The blood indicates she was injured, though the amount suggests a minor injury, maybe a cut or a nosebleed. But the male DNA is there, detective. When you find your suspect, we can match them." Sarah entered the DNA profile into every database available in 1990. CODIS was still being developed, not fully implemented yet, but she tried every system she could access. No matches. The killer either had no criminal record or had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. The case was going cold, and Sarah felt it slipping through her fingers like water. In May, she made a decision that would haunt her for years. She held a press conference announcing that while Carol Winter's disappearance remained an active investigation, without new leads or evidence, they had exhausted current investigative avenues. The case would remain open, but the daily search efforts would end. Margaret called her that night, voice shaking with rage. "You're giving up on my sister." "I'm not giving up," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow. "But I have limited resources, Margaret. I have other cases, other people who need help. I will never stop looking for Carol, but I can't keep 60 officers on this one case indefinitely." "She's not a case," Margaret said. "She's my sister. She's David's wife. She's a person who deserves justice." "I know," Sarah said. "God, I know." The years turned. 1990 became 1991, became 1992. Sarah got promoted to chief of detectives. Her first act was to create a dedicated cold case file for Carol Winters, storing all the evidence in climate-controlled conditions, preserving the DNA samples, maintaining the chain of custody, preparing for the day when technology might catch up to the crime. David eventually started dating a teacher from the elementary school, a kind woman named Ellen, who understood that he'd never stop being Carol's husband, that his heart had room for both past and present. he never removed his wedding ring. At his wedding to Ellen in 1995, he placed a single gingerbread cookie at the empty chair reserved for Carol, a memorial and a promise that he hadn't forgotten. Margaret remarried in 1994 and had a daughter she named Caroline, after Carol. The girl grew up hearing stories about her namesake aunt, the baker who made the best gingerbread in Vermont, the woman who'd been taken too soon. Robert Thorne became more involved in community service as years passed, as if Carol's disappearance had awakened something in him. He organized fundraisers for the volunteer fire department. He helped build houses with Habitat for Humanity. He became the person everyone called in a crisis, the man with a truck and tools and willingness to help at any hour. Sarah watched him over the years, this man who'd been so eager to search, so determined to help. She ran additional background checks, found nothing suspicious. His wife had died of cancer, documented and witnessed by 24 people. His military record was exemplary. His neighbors universally described him as helpful, quiet, always willing to lend a hand. If Robert Thorne had killed Carol Winters, he'd hidden it better than anyone Sarah had ever investigated. But sometimes, late at night when she reviewed the case files, she'd come back to those details. The way he'd organized the search, the way he'd known exactly where to look, the way he'd been so certain they'd find Carol, as if he knew something they didn't. But suspicion without evidence was worthless. And the evidence, what little existed, led nowhere. In 1995, the state police created a cold case unit specifically to review unsolved major crimes using advancing forensic technology. Sarah sent them everything related to Carol's case, 3 boxes of files and evidence, hoping fresh eyes might see patterns she'd missed. They worked the case for 6 months, bringing in profilers and forensic specialists, re-interviewing witnesses, examining the evidence with new equipment. They found nothing new. The lead investigator, a detective named Richard Paulson, called Sarah with his conclusions. Whoever did this was smart and lucky. They left minimal evidence. They knew the area intimately. They were comfortable enough in the bakery to clean up after themselves. That suggests someone local, someone Carol knew and trusted enough to let them in after hours. I know, Sarah said, thinking of Robert Thorne's blue Ford truck, thinking of dozens of other trucks just like it in Millbrook. But knowing isn't proving. In 1998, the bakery building on Main Street changed hands again, becoming a gift shop that lasted 3 years before closing. In 2001, it became a coffee shop, which thrived by carefully not mentioning the building's history, though everyone in Millbrook remembered. New residents would ask why the coffee shop was called Bean There, and locals would gently explain about Carol Winters, about the bakery that once filled these rooms with the smell of fresh bread and gingerbread. In 2000, Sarah Hartley retired from the police force after 33 years in law enforcement. She'd spent 21 of those years at least partially focused on finding Carol Winters, carrying the case with her through promotions and marriages and the birth of 2 grandchildren. On her last day, she boxed up Carol's case files and gave them to her successor, a sharp young detective named James Walsh, who just transferred from Boston. "Don't let this one die," Sarah told him, her voice fierce despite her 72 years. "Carol deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. This case stays with you, James. Promise me." James Walsh promised. He was 34 years old, determined to prove himself in his new position. He reviewed Carol's case within his first month, reading every report, studying every photograph, trying to see something new in evidence that was now 21 years old. But the trail was beyond cold. It was frozen solid, buried under 2 decades of dead ends. In 2005, David Winters died of a heart attack while coaching his basketball team. He was 62 years old, had been coaching for 38 years, had touched the lives of hundreds of students who remembered him as the quiet teacher who actually cared. His obituary mentioned Carol, still listed as missing, her disappearance framed as the great tragedy of David's life. Robert Thorne gave the eulogy at David's funeral, standing before 300 people in the Methodist Church, talking about David's dedication to his students, his love for Carol, his refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed impossible. David believed that someday we'd know what happened, Robert said, tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine grief. He believed in justice, even when justice seemed impossible. He believed Carol was at peace somewhere, and that someday the truth would come out. He died believing that. I hope he was right. Margaret sat in the front row, her daughter Caroline beside her, a young woman of 11 now with her aunt's dark curls and warm smile. She listened to Robert Thorne talk about her Uncle David, about the aunt Caroline had never met, and wondered if the truth would ever emerge. The case went quiet for years after David's death. It moved from active cold case to archived cold case, from the files that detectives reviewed annually to the boxes stored in climate-controlled rooms, waiting for technology or luck or divine intervention. Then came 2018, and everything in cold case investigation changed. Genetic genealogy burst onto the scene when investigators used publicly available DNA databases to identify the Golden State Killer, a case that had been cold for 40 years. Suddenly, old DNA evidence became new hope. James Walsh, now head of the cold case unit at age 52, watched the news about genetic genealogy with growing excitement. He thought immediately about Carol Winters, about the male DNA profile from her coat that had sat in a freezer for 29 years, preserved perfectly, waiting for technology to catch up. But genetic genealogy required time, money, and specialized expertise. The Vermont State Police had other priorities, newer cases, limited budgets. James added Carol's case to a list of cold cases that might benefit from genealogy, but she was one of 43 possibilities competing for resources. The years continued. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. James Walsh periodically checked on the DNA evidence, making sure it remained properly stored, properly documented, properly preserved. He knew Sarah Hartley was in a nursing home now, her mind sharp but her body failing. He visited her twice a year, bringing updates on cases she'd worked, including Carol's. "Still nothing?" Sarah would ask, her hands shaking from Parkinson's, her voice still fierce. "Still nothing," James would admit. "But I haven't given up. The evidence is good. When we get clearance for genetic genealogy, Carol will be first on my list." Then came February 2023, 34 years after Carol Winters disappeared. James Walsh attended a conference on genetic genealogy in Boston, a 2-day intensive training on using these new techniques. The presentations detailed how investigators were solving decades-old cases by comparing crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, building family trees, identifying suspects through their relatives. James sat in the conference room, watching case after case get solved through family trees and DNA matches, thinking about Carol Winters and the DNA profile that had waited 34 years for this technology. Back in his office the Monday after the conference, James pulled out the evidence box labeled Winters, Carol, Case 89-1847. He found the DNA profile from Carol's coat, the unknown male whose skin cells had been carefully preserved since 1989. He filled out the paperwork requesting genetic genealogy analysis, writing a detailed justification about why this case deserved resources. 3 weeks later, he got approval, and sent the DNA sample to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The forensic genealogist assigned to the case was a woman named Elena Rodriguez, who'd worked on 37 cold cases in the past 4 years, solving 18 of them. "This is good DNA," Elena told James on their first call. "Clean profile, good markers. If your killer has relatives who've used consumer DNA testing, I can find them." James held his breath. "How long will it take?" "Depends on what we find. Could be days, could be months. But I'll work it until we get an answer." The answer came 7 weeks later. James was sitting at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing another cold case, when Elena called. "I found a match," she said, and James heard the excitement in her voice. "Third cousin to your unknown male. From there, I built a family tree. It took time, but I've narrowed it down to 3 possible individuals born between 1940 and 1950, all living in Vermont in 1989. James's hands shook as he wrote down the names, his pen barely forming legible letters. The first name was Gerald Thompson, deceased in 2001, eliminated immediately. The second was Arthur Morrison, currently living in a nursing home with advanced Alzheimer's, unable to recognize his own children, much less answer questions about a murder from 1989. The third name made James's stomach drop to his feet. Robert James Thorne, born April 3, 1941, currently residing at 457 Maple Street, Millbrook, Vermont. The man who'd led the search for Carol. The man who'd comforted her family for 34 years. The man who'd given David's eulogy. The man who'd organized fundraisers and become a pillar of the community. The man who, according to genetic genealogy, backed by probability calculations showing 99.7% certainty, had left his DNA on Carol Winter's coat the night she disappeared. James spent 2 weeks verifying the genealogy. The family tree was solid, the science was sound, but he needed more than DNA before he could make an arrest. He needed a body. He pulled every file related to Robert Thorne, checked his military records, reviewed his construction business history, looked at properties he'd owned over the years. In 1987, Robert Thorne had purchased a small parcel of land 5 miles outside Millbrook, 20 acres of woods on the edge of state forest land. According to county records, he'd sold it in 1992, but the new owner had let it go for back taxes. It was now state property. James drove out to the land on a cold morning in March 2023. The woods were dense, still snow-covered in patches. He walked for an hour before he found what he was looking for. An old stone foundation, barely visible under decades of leaf litter. Some kind of hunting camp or cabin, long since collapsed. James took photos, marked coordinates on his GPS, and called for a ground-penetrating radar team. 2 days later, the radar revealed a disturbed area of soil 15 feet from the foundation, 12 feet deep. Something was buried there. The excavation took 4 hours. The forensics team worked carefully, documenting every layer. At 11 feet down, they hit fabric, a blue tarp, the kind used for construction projects in the 1980s. Inside the tarp, they found bones. The medical examiner confirmed it 3 days later. Carol Winters, identified through dental records. She'd been dead for 34 years. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. She'd been struck multiple times with something heavy and rigid. And mixed with her bones, the forensics team found wood fragments and dried plant matter. Carol had been wrapped in something before being put in the tarp, something that had decomposed over time. "It's Christmas greenery," the botanist said, examining the fragments. "Pine boughs, Holly, very old, but preserved by the cold and the depth." Carol had been buried with Christmas decorations. James Walsh drove to Robert Thorne's house on March 23, 2023. The man was 81 years old now, retired from construction, living alone in the same house where he'd lived when Carol disappeared. Robert answered the door with a smile, his face weathered but still sharp-eyed. "Detective Walsh, what brings you by?" "We found Carol," James said simply. Something flickered across Robert's face. Fear? Relief? It vanished too quickly to identify. "Where?" Robert asked, his voice steady. "On land you used to own, in the woods. She's been there since the night she disappeared." Robert's facade cracked. His shoulders sagged. He stepped back from the door, turning away. "I knew someone would find her eventually," he said quietly. "I thought I'd be dead by then." The confession came slowly, reluctantly, in the interview room at the police station. Robert sat across from James and his partner, his hands folded on the table, his voice matter-of-fact. "I loved her," he said. "I loved Carol. After Denise died, Carol was the only light in my life. She was kind to me. She saw me. Not the broken widower, not the lonely neighbor. She saw me." "So you killed her?" James asked. "I didn't mean to." Robert's voice broke. "I'd been watching her for months, calling her at the bakery just to hear her voice. I knew it scared her, but I couldn't stop. That night, December 22nd, I went to the bakery around 10:30. I'd been drinking. I'd worked up the courage to tell her how I felt." He paused, closing his eyes. "She was finishing the gingerbread men. I went in through the back door. She'd left it unlocked because she was expecting a delivery. I told her I loved her. I told her I'd loved her for years. I asked her to leave David and be with me." "What did she say?" James asked. "She was kind. That was the worst part. She was so damn kind." Robert's eyes opened, wet with tears. "She said she loved me too, but as a friend, as a brother. She said David was her husband, her soulmate. She tried to let me down gently. And you got angry. I got desperate." Robert's hands clenched. "I grabbed her arms. I begged her. I told her I'd waited years. I'd been patient. I'd earned her love. She pulled away. She told me to leave. She said if I didn't leave, she'd call the police." The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I saw the rolling pin on the counter," Robert continued, his voice now a whisper. "I picked it up. I don't remember deciding to swing it. But suddenly Carol was on the floor, and there was blood, and she wasn't moving. I kept hitting her because I couldn't make it not true. I couldn't take it back." James felt sick. "What happened next?" "I panicked. I wrapped her in the Christmas decorations she'd been using to decorate the gingerbread display. Pine boughs, holly, garland, it was all I could think of. Then I found a tarp in her supply closet. I carried her to my truck. I drove to the land I owned. I'd been there the week before, cutting firewood. The ground wasn't frozen yet under the snow. I dug for hours. And then you locked the bakery and turned off the lights." "Yes. I went back around 11:30. I washed the floor where she'd fallen. I took the rolling pin. I arranged everything to look normal. I thought if there was no evidence, maybe people would think she'd just left, run away, started a new life somewhere. But then you led the search for her," James said, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. "You comforted David. You organized fundraisers." Robert looked up, his eyes hollow. "I had to be there. I had to make sure no one looked in the right place. And I think part of me wanted to be caught. I wanted someone to see through me. But no one did. I was so good at helping that no one suspected I'd hurt her." The confession was recorded, documented, signed. Robert Thorne was charged with first-degree murder. At 81, he would spend whatever time he had left in prison. The trial began in November 2023. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the genealogy, the confession. They showed photos of Carol's remains, wrapped in Christmas decorations like a grotesque gift. The defense attorney argued that Robert's age and failing health warranted compassion, but the prosecutor reminded the jury about the 34 years Robert had spent lying, comforting Carol's family, while knowing exactly where she was. He sat at their Christmas table, the prosecutor said in closing arguments. Year after year, he ate meals with David Winters, the man whose wife he'd murdered. He listened to Margaret talk about her sister. He helped them remember Carol, while he carried the secret of her death. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Robert showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. At his age, it was a death sentence. Margaret attended every day of the trial. She was 67 now, her daughter Caroline beside her. When the guilty verdict came down, Margaret didn't cry. She simply stood and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, reporters asked how she felt. "I feel nothing," Margaret said. "He took my sister. He took 34 years of answers. He let us celebrate Christmas every year, knowing he'd killed Carol on Christmas Eve. There's no punishment that equals that." The case closed officially in December 2023, 34 years after Carol disappeared. The newspapers ran retrospectives. True crime podcasts analyzed the case. Robert Thorne became another entry in the catalog of murderers who hide in plain sight. But in Millbrook, Vermont, the story had a quieter ending. The new bakery on Main Street, the one that replaced Carol's place, created a new cookie. They called it Carol's Gingerbread Man. All proceeds went to a scholarship fund for culinary students, established in Carol's name. Margaret drove down from Burlington every Christmas to buy a dozen of the cookies. She gave them to kids in the neighborhood, telling them about her sister who loved baking, who made the best gingerbread in Vermont, who died doing what she loved. The land where Carol was buried became a memorial site. Margaret planted a dogwood tree there, Carol's favorite. A small plaque read, "Carol Winters, 1946-1989. Baker, friend, sister. Found at last." Sarah Hartley, now 91 and living in a nursing home, watched the news coverage of the trial from her room. She'd been right all along. Someone close. Someone trusted. Someone who'd helped search while hiding the truth. She died 3 weeks after the verdict, her last case finally solved. In the end, Carol's story became what it always should have been. Not a mystery, not a cold case, but a memorial to a woman who baked with love, who treated everyone with kindness, who deserved better than the death she got. The person who killed her spent decades pretending to mourn while basking in the trust of those he'd betrayed. But even the most careful killers leave DNA behind. Even the deepest graves eventually give up their secrets. And sometimes justice comes not from brilliant detective work, but from the patient advancement of science and the refusal of people like Margaret to stop demanding answers. Robert Thorne will die in prison, his reputation destroyed, his legacy one of betrayal and murder. Carol Winters will be remembered for gingerbread men and kindness, for a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and hope. In Millbrook, Vermont, every Christmas Eve, someone places fresh gingerbread men on the memorial stone in the woods. No one knows who does it. But every year, they appear. Perhaps it's Margaret. Perhaps it's someone who remembered Carol's smile. Perhaps it's the town itself, refusing to let her be forgotten. The cookies are always perfect, always decorated with care, always proof that some lights can't be extinguished, even by darkness that lasts 34 years. Carol Winters is home, and the man who took her away is finally where he belongs. That's not the ending anyone wanted, but it's the ending truth demanded. And in cases like this, truth is the only justice that matters.